The Apollo program was introduced in November of 1960 during a speech for President John F. Kennedy. His goal was to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The Apollo program consisted of 12 manned and 3 unmanned launches. The program lasted between 1967 and 1972.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
2 types of rockets would be used, the Saturn 1B and the Saturn V. Each spacecraft would be made of 3 parts, the service module, the command module, and the lunar module. On January 27, 1967, 3 crew members lost their lives during a practice countdown. The 3 men, Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Robert Taft, died when a fire was ignited and pressure was built up in the cabin. The men's last words were, "We're burning up." The Apollo program was halted and an investigation was launched. This was named Apollo 1 in honor of the men. Their sacrifice helped the program reach the goal of landing on the moon. After this accident, many people were upset and wanted to end the program because they thought the goals were impossible and wanted to put a stop to future tragedies. Apollo 4 was an unmanned mission to test the command service module. Apollo 7 was launched October 11, 1968, and nicknamed the Walt, Wall, and Dawn Show. It was the first manned mission to test the command service module and orbit the Earth. It was also the first live TV broadcast from a manned spacecraft. It even won an Emmy. Even though the crew got colds, everything was perfect. Apollo 8 was launched December 21, 1968. It was the first spacecraft to be launched by a Saturn V rocket. It was the first time humans would orbit the moon, which they did 10 times. It was also the first time humans would be under the influence of gravity. The crew made 2 live TV broadcasts on Christmas Eve. One showed Earth coming over the horizon. The crew was Frank Borman, James A. Lovell Jr., and William A. Anders. The mission was a success. Apollo 9 was launched on March 3, 1969. The crew consisted of Jim McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell Swihart. Apollo 9 was the first test with the lunar module. It would test the rendezvous and redocking of the command lunar module. This test was a success. Apollo 10 was launched on May 18, 1969. This mission would combine Apollos 8 and 9 and would be a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. This mission would test the lunar module in lunar orbit. The crew for Apollo 10 was Eugene Cernan, John Young, and Thomas Stafford. Apollo 11 was launched on July 16, 1969. The crew was Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. During this mission, the first moon landing and walk occurred. The spacecraft entered lunar orbit on July 19th and landed on the moon at the Sea of Tranquility on July 20th. The lunar module spent 22 hours on the moon. During this time, a 600 million watched on TV back on Earth. Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
That's all right, I don't mind a bit.
They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface.
On the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin performed experiments and tests and gathered data and samples. Armstrong first said when he landed on the moon, "It looks like a collection of just about every variety of shapes, angularities, and granularities, every variety of rock you could find. It looks as though they're going to have some interesting colors to them." When they were safely back in the lunar module, President Nixon placed a call to them, which was named the most historic telephone call ever made. The crew was safely returned to Earth. President Kennedy's goal had been reached. Apollo 12 was launched on November 14, 1969. The crew was Alan Bean, Charles Conrad, and Richard Gordon. The mission would be the second moon landing, and the moonwalkers would be Alan Bean and Charles Conrad. The lunar module landed on the moon on November 19th in the Ocean of Storms. The 2 astronauts retrieved pieces of the Surveyor 3 craft. They also performed many experiments, especially involving the soil. Many rocks and soil samples were taken. Apollo 13 was launched on April 11, 1970. This Apollo mission was a near disaster. The crew, James L. Lovell Jr., John Swigert Jr., and Fred Haig Jr., had to abort the mission. The cause of the commotion was the explosion of an oxygen tank. The crew used the lunar module as a lifeboat and lived in there for 3 days. This accident is when the famous line, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem," was said by Swigert. They splashed down safely in the Pacific. The reaction of the people was the same after the Apollo 1 fire. They were upset that the crew spent 4 unsafe hours in space. They wanted to end the program because they said NASA had reached its goal. Apollo 14 was launched on January 31, 1971. The people who carried out this mission were Alan Shepard Jr., Stuart Roosa, and Edgar Mitchell. The mission was the first delayed Apollo mission because of the Apollo 13 accident and the weather. The mission objectives were to explore the landing site and to develop working in a lunar environment. Apollo 14 used the Apollo 13 landing site from Kwa Formation. Alan Shepard, the oldest man to walk on the moon, also hit 2 golf balls on the moon. Apollo 15 was launched on July 26, 1971. The landing site was the Hadley Apennines, and this was the first mission to use the lunar rover vehicle. One difficulty was when one parachute failed to open during splashdown, but the astronauts were okay. The big controversy was when a scandal broke out. The scandal was that 3 crewmen were accused of taking souvenir items into space and were paid to do so. The U.S. Senate was involved and an investigation performed. 3 years later, the astronauts were cleared. Apollo 16 was launched on April 16, 1972. They landed on the moon at the Descartes Highland, which is the highest Apollo landing site. The crew, Duke, Mattingly, and Young, had landed in an unexplored region of the moon. While on this mission, the team set the moon rover record speed at 11 miles per hour. Apollo 17 was launched on December 7, 1972. The landing site was Taurus-Littrow Valley. Ron Evans and Dr. Harrison Smith, the last person to walk on the moon, performed the last spacewalk. Apollo 17 traveled farther with the lunar rover vehicle and returned the greatest amount of rock and soil samples. This was the last Apollo mission. Apollos 18, 19, and 20 were canceled due to budget cuts. After the program ended, many people lost interest in the moon. They moved on to other things like the ISS and Mars. No other person has visited the moon after Apollo 17. The Apollo program was pushed to the side, but the lives that were lost would always remain in the hearts of many. We will never forget the day man first stepped on the moon.